everybody. Um, Today I'm going to talk about some yoga philosophy and talk about how you can really incorporate the ideals and concepts of yoga into your regular life. And I think it's really important to know yoga philosophy, even if it's not going to be something you study in depth. I am by no means an expert in yoga philosophy. I have a lot to learn, and it is pretty deep in itself as a tradition. But I think it's important to know the context of the practices and activities that you do, especially when they come from other people and other cultures, as with yoga being from South Asia and India. And so just knowing a little bit of yoga philosophy, I think can just really help us get that perspective and that appreciation for the many teachers that have come before me and before my teachers, and what they conceive yoga as, and also how that has also really evolved a lot and changed a lot to what we see as yoga today. So I'm going to talk about the Yoga Sutras, and in particular the yamas and niyamas for a little bit now. So about, I guess a guesstimate is in between like 400 and 600 CE. There was a text that was codified called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by the sage Patanjali. And in it, he talks about the 8 limbs of yoga. And the 8 limbs were a pathway towards spiritual liberation. And they are in an order from 1 to 8, but it is not something that you necessarily, in today's world, need to look at and do 1 to 8. And they actually interconnect and interrelate with each other as well. But the idea behind yoga was really a lifestyle and a deep appreciation for the way that you practice, and how that is not just what you practice, like you go and do a yoga class and go home, but really how you practice living as a person. And so I'll do a quick overview of the 8 limbs of yoga for you. The 8 limbs of yoga starts with what's called yama, and that's the ethical restraints or things that you should try to avoid doing. Then it goes to the niyama, and that's the ethical observances, so things that you should strive towards, virtues or ideals, if you will. And then it goes to asana, which is posture. And this is what we do a lot of the times nowadays when we talk about doing yoga, or whether or not someone is a yoga teacher. It's somebody who teaches posture most of the time. Then it goes to pranayama, which is controlled breathing techniques, which you may have a little bit more familiarity with in terms of when you're doing a yoga class. There are breathing techniques that your teacher may teach you. Then there's pratyahara, which is sense withdrawal, dharana, which is concentration, dhyana, which is meditation, and samadhi, which is spiritual enlightenment, or that sense of oneness. And so I'm going to break it down a little bit more and talk about the difference between the first 4 and the last 4. So again, it's the 8 limbs of yoga. So the first 4 limbs, yama, niyama, asana, and pranayama, are the gross practices, or the gross limbs. And what I mean by that is they're the more obvious, tangible ones. You can kind of tell in yourself when you are behaving in a certain way with the yama and niyama. And also in your posture, that's a lot more obvious. You can tell if you're doing this posture or not, or how you're doing a posture, you can see that. And along with that is also in your breathing techniques. It's another thing you can kind of, it's a more tangible practice you can do, and you can see whether or not you're really breathing in a certain technique or not. The last 4 are the more subtle practices. So pratyahara is sense withdrawal. That's not something you can necessarily see in people, right? You can't, like, you can assume perhaps if someone's like, yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm practicing pratyahara, I'm just really going inward. But you really actually don't know if they're doing that or not. It's a lot more subtle, and it's a lot more personal of a practice. And along the lines with that, and where it goes from that, is to concentration and meditation. And same thing with concentration and meditation. Those are very personal, internal activities and practices. And then, of course, the last one is samadhi, and that is also something that is very subtle and may not be obvious for many people at all, and may be more, for some, an ideal than absolutely, like, I wanted to do it, I did samadhi right as I was doing child's pose. It's really not something you do, the last four, as much as something you experience internally, whereas the first four of the limbs, posture, breathing, and ethics, that's something you can really tangibly do. So I just want to break that down a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about each of the yamas and niyamas, because each of those are also really, really thorough and important. It can be really deep. I'm just going with a little bit of an overview, and again, I'm not an expert on yoga philosophy, so if you find any of this interesting, I really encourage you to look it up more for yourself. But in the tradition, yama is the first, and yama is the ethical restraints, or how I consider is like the don'ts, like the do's and the don'ts. And the yamas are the things that you shouldn't do, or you should try to avoid. And so the first one is ahimsa, and they really make up, that concept of ahimsa really makes up the rest of them. And so ahimsa is non-violence or non-violation, and so that's along the lines of don't harm. And ahimsa, from there, influences the rest of them, because when you can kind of come back to whether or not am I doing harm, you can kind of see the rest of them being relating to, like, oh, if I'm partaking in this, then I'm perhaps doing harm, which is why I should also avoid them. So the second is satya, which is truthfulness or sincerity, and again, that lends to don't lie. And so we can already see here, of course, if you lie, we probably know if we lie, we can do harm. The third is asteya, or don't steal. The fourth is brahmacharya, and one of the definitions to think about brahmacharya is moderation, or a containment, really, of your energy. So the way that it was back in the day, where people practiced brahmacharya, it was thought about as celibacy, and something that was like a super personal, very like strict choice of the yogis. But a lot of times, for how people are interpreting it now for modern times, and really the essence of it is really about your energy. So containment of your energy. And then aparigraha is the last of the yama, which is non-clinging or non-possessiveness, and that can relate to saying, don't be greedy. And so you can already see how the four follows along do no harm. And so that's kind of how they work together. Now I'm going to go to the second limb, which is the niyamas, and that are they're like the virtues or ethical observances. They're like the do's, So we went through the don'ts, and now we're going to go through the do's, the things that we should aspire to do. And like personally speaking, I find that the virtues, the do's, are actually a lot harder than the things to avoid doing. Take it as you will. These are ideals that we work towards, and not really saying like, you don't act this way and live this way 24/7, and like you're a bad person. Like it's not really meant to be like that. I think more than anything, it is asking us to reflect and to see where we can do better. So the first is saucha, or purity or cleanliness, both physically and mentally. The second is santosha, or contentment. The third is tapas, which can be defined as discipline or zeal. Tapas is like the inner fire in you. The fourth is svadhyaya, very fun word to say. Vadhyaya, and that is self-study, and so being self-aware. And then the last is Ishvara Pranadhana, which means to be with the flow, or to surrender to God or the universe, or just to acknowledge and know that there is something bigger than you. And so those are the 5 niyamas. And so they are the ethics of yoga and the first 2 limbs before we even start to like talk about posture or breathing or meditation, which is really interesting to think about, because we don't necessarily go to a yoga class and make sure we practice the yama and niyama before we do our practice, which is again mostly asana and a little bit of pranayama, which is breathing. Asana is posture. And so it's really interesting to kind of know that in our society, how we have kind of selected to practice yoga and see yoga, or perhaps maybe how people who have the power to spread the message of yoga have chosen to inform us about yoga. I will say there's definitely a lot missing when you go to a typical yoga class. And you know, even when it comes to me, when I teach yoga, I do try to share a yoga philosophy concept, but I don't always do it. And it's always like a single concept, which is only one thing in the great universe of 8 limbs of yoga, and then the bigger universe of the Yoga Sutras, which is the text where the 8 limbs are codified in, and then in the bigger universe of yoga philosophy and Eastern philosophy. So it's just really interesting to be aware of that. And so now I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit more information about the idea of asana, or posture. So in the Yoga Sutras, what's really fascinating about it is that when they talked about posture, really the only line is that posture should be done with a sense of steadiness and ease. And not so much anything about do child's pose or downward dog or chair pose, or whatever all the other poses that we come to know when we take a yoga class. It's really not about that at all. And so what's really interesting about the idea of the Yoga Sutras, it's really a text on living and also on meditation to achieve that spiritual enlightenment or spiritual liberation. And so, so it's interesting, but one of the things to also, to always keep in mind is that we can take that message of practicing with steadiness and ease in our yoga practice, in our physical practices, whenever. Because posture done with steadiness and ease can be done in any posture. And so I think in their time, it was really talking about your seated posture and your alignment, being in alignment, that steadiness and easeful alignment so that you can sit and basically meditate. And in our time, we can try to find that same goal in any pose, even the ones that may be a little bit more challenging. We can still try to find a sense of steadiness and ease, even when you're doing Warrior 2 and you maybe begin to get a little bit sore, or when you're doing a stretch and you're really getting stretched out. Maybe even when you're in something like Shavasana, which is the ultimate, relaxation pose and restful pose. And, sometimes even our minds, our bodies might look like it's stable and at ease, but our minds are like, wah, 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 wah. And so you can, if you were to practice Shavasana with that idea of steadiness and ease in mind, it will include your mind, basically. It would include trying to find a way to quiet down the mind. And speaking of that, and I maybe should have said this at the beginning, but basically, like the first sentence of the Yoga Sutras was basically a statement of saying, like, now we're gonna get into the Yoga Sutras. And the second statement Sutra 1.2 is definitely very simple. It's just yoga is a practice of quieting the mind. And there's many different translations to that. Like mine, that translation I just put is just like a very simple, simplified version. Some other ones are yoga is a practice of stopping the mind stirrings or the mind chatter. Yoga is a practice of reducing or ceasing the mind turnings. All kinds of statement like that, which really comes down to yoga is the practice of quieting the mind. And the layout of it includes how you live, and include doing postures with a sense of steadiness and ease. And then the last 4 of the limbs, the more subtle practices, which is center draw, concentration, meditation, and finding that spiritual enlightenment or sense of oneness. All those things are a part of helping you quiet the mind. It's part of the practice of doing that. And so it's really all really interesting, and I swear I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg on just how interesting yoga philosophy can be, and it's just important to know. Even if you don't remember every single yama niyama and practice it, which again, I actually think you maybe should, because I think it's very, what's the word? Like, it's very universal. It's very universal to be practicing do no harm and don't lie, don't steal, and like try to have a pure mind and body and contentment and, you know, find self-awareness. Like all these things, all these ideals I think are really universal. And it doesn't need to be like, it doesn't need to be like a very strict dogmatic thing, and also it is not a religious thing per se, because yoga comes from the East and is part of Eastern philosophy, but it's from South Asia, and so it can be accessible to, I think, people of all beliefs and faiths. But for the most part, I just encourage you to consider that yoga is more than just the physical practice, is more than just asana, and how that can change your relationship to the practice. Because it's really, really important to give credit where credit is due. We do not need to give credit to the people who are, quote, in charge and telling us like, oh, yoga means you need to buy expensive yoga pants and go on expensive yoga retreats and practice, I don't know, downward facing dog and do all this other fancy body stuff. And it's not to say that those things can't be fun, but it is to say that it may not be a fully accurate portrayal of what yoga is. So I really encourage you to look and consider the 8 limbs of yoga at the very least. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something from it. I will definitely be back to talk about some more things in the Yoga Sutras and to tell you more about yoga philosophy. So bye for now.